Welcome to uh, it's being recorded. Welcome to everyone. My name is David Swanson. I'm campaign coordinator at rootsaction.org. This is a teach-in as part of the teach-in network at teachinnetwork.org. And the topic here is state level progressive successes and how to get more of them. There are states that are doing good things successfully, restricting super PACs, banning slavery in state constitutions, abolishing the death penalty, imposing taxes on the super wealthy, etc. And there are people who have some experience and some expertise because they've been part of these successful campaigns in various states around the country. So we thought we would have a few of them talk a bit about what has worked and what it feels like to succeed at something, and then have questions from you all at the end for all of the speakers together. So you can put questions at any time into the chat. Our first speaker, like all good people in the world, is from my town, Charlottesville, Virginia, and has been part of abolishing the death penalty. Rob Pugenclass is executive director of Justice Forward Virginia, a public defender-led nonprofit that promotes criminal justice reform through smart, contemporary, evidence-informed policy advocacy. As executive director, Rob works with practitioners, lawmakers, and other advocates to enact criminal legal reforms at the General Assembly in Richmond, Virginia. He has served as a legal aid lawyer in both Iowa and Virginia and started his career as a public defender in Newport News, Virginia. Rob has argued cases on behalf of indigent clients in both the Iowa Supreme Court and the Supreme Court of Virginia. Rob Pugenclass, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, David. Thanks for having me, and appreciate the opportunity to be here on behalf of Justice Forward Virginia. So as David said, we were part of the effort. It was a broad coalition that abolished the death penalty in Virginia, becoming the first state in the South to do so back in 2021. And I just want to set the table to lay out just really how terrible things were in Virginia as far as the death penalty goes. Virginia has executed more people than any other state in the country. That's 1,390 executions. Starting in 1608, the death penalty was over 400 years old in Virginia when we abolished it 4 years ago. It's now has the third most executions in the modern era, which is since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Behind just Texas and Oklahoma, we're now tied with Florida. So we continue to move down the rankings, which is great. But that's 572. There were 572 executions in Texas in the modern era. Virginia was second with 113. And that number doesn't include the real total, which, if you include lynchings, the line for centuries was pretty thin between official executions and unofficial. But I'm just given the official numbers. Virginia was the quickest state to execute people once they received a death sentence. It generally took less than 8 years. The state of Virginia, Commonwealth of Virginia, defended more death sentences than any other state. Fewer cases were overturned on appeal in Virginia when someone was sentenced to death. And there were a good number of capital cases filed each year, between 15 and 30 every year in Virginia. So the death penalty was very much a powerhouse in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And what really changed, of course, there were problems. There was a famous exoneration of Earl Washington, who was a intellectually disabled man who falsely confessed under pressure to raping and murdering a 19-year-old white woman. Earl Washington was black. That was in 1984. He came within days of being executed, and a stay was entered, and eventually he was exonerated by DNA evidence in 2000. Um, the racial problems were well documented. 202 of the 236 people executed between 1908 and 1972 were black in Virginia. And whether you were subject to the death penalty was more a function of who happened to be the prosecutor in the jurisdiction where you were charged rather than the circumstances of the crime. That we know that's true about the death penalty across the country, but it was just as true in Virginia. And then Virginia had the distinction of paying their court-appointed counsel the lowest rate in the country, and that was true for decades. So there was quite an effort from folks in the abolition community, and I give a lot of credit to an institution I was proud to be the board chair of for a couple of years, the Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, which was the state chapter of abolitionists. And when we got together to finally abolish the thing, it was a broad-based effort. There was the Black clergy got very involved, family members of victims. I think about Rachel Sutphin, whose dad was a sheriff's deputy in Montgomery County and was murdered. The man who committed that crime was ultimately the last person, hopefully ever executed in Virginia. And Rachel testified in front of the General Assembly in support of abolition, even though her dad was one of those crime victims. And then we had a handful of reform-minded prosecutors who were willing to go on the record and tell the press that they were in favor of abolishing the death penalty. They weren't going to do it. They weren't going to charge people with death sentence eligible crimes. And so it was a broad effort, but what ultimately condemned the death penalty, if you will, in Virginia was a couple of studies in 2000 and 2001, state studies showed that Virginia's indigent defense system was really operating at very poor levels, and that death sentences were going to be in jeopardy because the Supreme Court had ruled that you can't have ineffective assistance of counsel. The Sixth Amendment guarantees your right to the effective assistance of counsel. And so it was really the proponents of the death penalty who wanted to ensure that death sentences would be upheld on appeal that said we need to do something to shore up this system of weak defense attorneys. And what they did was create regional capital defender offices, 4 of them in Virginia in 2002. And those capital defender offices turned out to be the end of the death penalty in Virginia, because once people had the effective assistance of counsel, they no longer got death sentences. In the 19 years, well, the offices first became operational in 2004. They were created in 2002, came online in 2004, and then shut down when we abolished the death penalty in 2021. And in those 17 years, there was one person who was executed who had been represented by one of the 4 capital defense offices. So the effective defense was really what got rid of the death penalty. By the time that we had abolished the death penalty in 2021, there were only 2 people left on death row, because so few people were actually being condemned by Virginia juries, that there was functionally not much of a death penalty left. That people were still getting charged with capital murder, people were still being convicted of capital murder, but there were very few death sentences. Only one, no death sentences since 2011, and only 2 people were still on the row in 2021 when we finally ended the death penalty. And credit to the politicians who, for years wanted to abolish the death penalty and didn't have the political will behind them to do it. You know, we did have a moment in 2020 and 2021 when criminal legal reform um, was finally available in Virginia, and there were some ready politicians who Scott Servell, who's a criminal defense lawyer, longtime member of the Virginia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. He's now the Senate Majority Leader, and he carried the bill along with Delegate Mike Mullen, who was a former prosecutor, was happy to carry the bill in the House, and a Democratic governor, Ralph Northam, who, you know, I think would consider this one of his crowning achievements as in his time as governor, the 74th governor of Virginia, to sign the abolition into law.
Great. I've got lots of questions, and there are good questions in the chat, but we're going to get to them after our additional speakers. But I wonder if our additional speakers have anything to say about this sort of two-step approach of effectively ending something and then formally ending it. I wonder where else that applies. Let's go next to Phineas Baxendall, who can talk to us about something that's very, very popular and very, very rarely done, which is taxing the mega wealthy. Phineas Baxendall is the policy director at the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. He has a long history as a researcher deeply involved in improving policy, especially at the state level and in Massachusetts. In his nearly 8 years at Mass Budget, Dr. Baxendall has served in numerous leadership capacities. In September 23, he was named the organization's interim president before returning to his role as policy director the following year. His policy knowledge and advocacy acumen have been instrumental in the organization's greatest achievements, and we will hear about at least one of those. Phineas Baxendall, take it away.
Well, thank you, thank you, Dave. Thank you for having me here, and you know, on behalf of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, we're really glad to be speaking here. But it really is the Raise Up Massachusetts coalition that deserves this victory. We served as a kind of think tank and research arm for this coalition. The coalition is a combination of community groups, faith groups, and organized labor groups, and that three legs of that stool were really important in the work. What I'm going to talk to you about is the Fair Share Amendment, or also known at the time as the millionaire tax, because what it was a tax which starts only on your second million. So nobody gets, you know, Massachusetts had until this one a flat tax where it was 5% no matter if you are a billionaire or if you are, you know, working as a clerk, it was 5%, you know, and it had been that way. Really, Massachusetts was one of the first states to have a state income tax back in 2016 when they put it in. They were scared about the idea of a graduated income tax. You know, there had just been a kind of Bolshevik revolution going on, and you know they voted down that, but they were willing to say we'll have a income tax. We just won't let there be higher rates for people with higher incomes. And three times there was a ballot initiative. Massachusetts uh, has the tool of a popular ballot initiative that we can change things when the legislature won't. And three times there were ballot initiatives before ours to try and change this. And the last one lost 72% was the loss. So every time the opposition had, you know, kind of spent a ton and convinced people that this was just some ploy of the legislature, that they were going to end up taxing the middle class in this, and that it was a big tax grab for their, you know, legislators' salaries or however they thought about it. And so this effort really took almost 10 years to win because uh, in Massachusetts, the the ban on graduated income taxes was actually in the state constitution. So we had to change the state constitution, which requires 4 years to do because you have to two different 2-year sessions, get all these different kinds of approvals and gather more signatures and keep going back for it. And the first 4-year loop of it, the the Republican governor had changed the court sufficiently, and the court ended up uh, throwing it out over what people thought was a technicality, which wouldn't happen. So we had to go back to the drawing board and do this again for another 4 years. And I mean, it was hard for the coalition. We had to say, "Are we up for doing this again?" And it, you know, it was really a sense that we were in this together and we were going to make this happen. And it was ridiculous that Massachusetts, people think of as such a progressive place, actually had this really retrograde tax structure and some of the highest inequality of any state in America. So, the effort went, and we saw a lot of opposition. The Boston Globe, which is, can be pretty progressive on some things, but is owned by billionaires. And, they kind of brought out the Steely knives to do all kinds of attacks. They ultimately quietly did endorse it, but the attacks were much louder. And we saw, all the kind of business groups, the tech groups, which are really big, spend big and come up with all kinds of arguments. And they were saying that even though we had shown, and we're working with IRS data to do this, that it was, less than 1% of the population has an income over $1 million in a year. Um, there was, it was 0.7%, but they kept on saying, no, no, this is going to hit, older people who've got their nest eggs that they try and catch in, homeowners, if you sell your home, small business owners, sort of, they tried to change the face of who was going to pay the millionaire's tax. And they had, some really uh, effective messaging on this stuff, and we saw our poll numbers go down. And the biggest thing that really we hadn't anticipated, and which became this real obstacle for us, is we one of our sort of internal kind of mantras on this was, if we make this about taxes, it's going to be a harder fight. We need to make this about what the money's going to be spent on. And the the measure is written and in the Constitution to say that they can only be spent on public education and on transportation, including mass transportation. And they sort of kept saying that it was going to be all kinds of other things that it would get spent on, but we really held to that. And in doing so, and in trying to say that, look at education, look at transportation, what we hadn't anticipated was the pandemic, obviously, but what we hadn't anticipated was that there was going to be all of this federal money pouring into Massachusetts like other states. So we had this unanticipated giant surplus in our state budget the very year, and only as a one-time temporary thing. The moment that we are pointing to all of the deficits that we have, that we can't hire more teachers, we can't repair our school buildings, the legislature is saying, wow, we now have all this money, we can't spend it fast enough. And the governor actually, through a kind of obscure rule, was sending people checks, a kind of refund check, because there was too much money. So we had to really focus on what we hadn't thought we were going to have to focus on, was the tax disparity. That, that how it was that all in all, that the very richest people end up spending less on their taxes as a portion of their income, and just trying to make it about tax fairness, and that we as a more progressive state need to have a more fair tax system. And that was a harder fight. And the ballot question ended up being fairly close, only a couple percentage points. We didn't even have it announced the very night, but we won. and a lot of people had written us off, and it was a resounding win. And they had said, we'd been saying through great work from the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, who helped us crunch the numbers, we'd said that it was going to be at least $2.6 billion a year. And officially they said, no, 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 the rich people, some of them are going to leave, or this isn't going to happen. It's only going to be $1 billion a year. And now it's been proven, now it's going to be almost $3 billion a year. So $3 billion a year is coming in. We have seen real transformation in Massachusetts as a result of this. Other states had to pull back all these policies after the pandemic. They ended their free school lunch and meals programs. We kept ours with the fair share money. They ended the deep support for early education and care for child care providers. We kept ours. We have free community college across the state about this. We have of our 16 public transit systems, the biggest one is still charges, but the other 15 are free. You get on the bus, none of them charge. All the regional transit systems, the K-12 can go on. There's been just education and transportation. Every year there's sort of new things being added. It has been a utter success story. I mean, we're going to still have challenges like everybody else with this federal mess going on, but it has been really made a difference in people's lives. And the coalition has really worked hard to make sure that people know this was funded by Fair Share, that was funded by Fair Share, so we can build upon that and people can understand that progressive taxation makes changes in people's lives. So I'll stop there.
Wonderful, incredible success story, and great questions in my mind and in the chat. I hope we can get to soon, but we have one more speaker I want to go to for another similar success story. This about reining in the power of one of the forces that is most destructively corrupting our elections, super PACs. Anna Keller is the executive director of Democracy Maine, a hybrid organization that brings together the League of Women Voters of Maine, Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, and Maine Students Vote. Anna grew up in Maine before earning a BA in political science from Yale University and a master's in conflict studies from the London School of Economics. Their early career focused on democratic transitions and anti-corruption in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. At Democracy Maine, Anna has led successful legislative and ballot initiative campaigns to expand ranked choice voting and small donor funding programs, pass the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and modernize Maine's election and voter registration systems. So we would love to know what's worked in all of those successes, but including reining in the super PACs. Anna Keller.
Thank you so much for having me. I want to talk a little bit about this work, and I think this fits in well with what I've heard from folks so far about how this is work that builds on itself over time. So in 1996, when I was 6 years old, the people of Maine passed a referendum to create our clean election system. And so clean elections is what we call our small donor public funding system. It means that people who run for the state legislature or governor in Maine can choose to use the clean election system. It means that they can qualify for public funding to run their campaign. They have to not take any money from special interest from big donors. What they do is they have to collect $5 qualifying contributions from Maine voters or voters in their district if they're running for the legislature. And then with that show of community support, they qualify for a limited amount of money to run their campaign. They're not allowed to raise or spend any more than that. And this program has meant that people who otherwise would have been excluded from running for office who are from all different working class backgrounds. We see that for people, anyone for whom fundraising would be an obstacle to getting involved or to running a successful campaign, those people have a real pathway toward participating and being elected. We've seen over the course of the last now almost 30 years, and we are now at 25 years since the first candidates ran using clean elections. Because we've had this program in place for a long time, we've been able to see what parts of it have worked, what parts of it the results are a little bit more mixed, and where there are gaps. And I got involved in this work in 2014 after the Supreme Court, first in Citizens United and then in a subsequent decision, made a piece of the Maine Clean Elections program not viable anymore. It took away matching funds because the Supreme Court, as part of saying that money is speech,
Anna, I've lost your audio. I don't know if that's true for everyone, but it just
Yeah,
went.
we lost her.
how is it now?
It's good.
Sometimes those AirPods just drop. Um, if you were running as a clean elections candidate and your opponent wasn't, the opponent raised more money, or even if a PAC spent money on that candidate's behalf, you would automatically qualify for matching funds, and it kept it at a level playing field. That trigger, that idea that you would automatically get more money if your opponent spent more, that's what the Supreme Court struck down in Arizona, where they had a similar system, and then in Maine. Without that, clean elections candidates were getting outspent and fewer people were choosing to use the system. For a long time, from 2000 to about 2010, we had over 80% of candidates that used clean elections. It had to be a voluntary system, but we saw that there was high participation, including really cross-partisan high participation. After the Supreme Court, that got much harder. And so I got involved in a second referendum to go back to the voters to create a supplemental funding program. So it just meant that there was another way for candidates to stay competitive. I loved being part of that campaign because ballot initiatives can be a wonderful thing when you're saying, in the face of the Supreme Court, saying something that seems so illogical and so counter to how we want our democracy to function. I was able to go to people and say, would you like to do something about this? Well, I actually have something very concrete that you can do. You can help collect signatures at your polling place on election day. We can get this on the ballot. We can pass this law. And then we'll have actually fixed a problem here. We won't have to hope that our elected officials do it. We're actually fixing it ourselves. And so that direct democracy is a really powerful thing and a really powerful organizing tool that I'm very grateful that we have. Since we had that campaign, which we won in 2015, we've seen that the rates of participation for clean elections have gone back up, and we've really stabilized at about 60% of candidates use it. And so it's become such a normal part of life in Maine that it is seen as completely normal, and in some ways has even been co-opted by the partisan political structure. People just assume most candidates will use clean elections, and then, PACs raise money outside of that. If you're running for leadership, maybe you still have to do real fundraising. We've seen many fewer people use it for governor because they don't like being cut off from the national sources of big money if they have ambitions. And so we've seen where it helps to get people into the game. It really has helped in that way. We have a much more diverse legislature than we would otherwise, and it's really launched the careers of many people who wouldn't have been able to run otherwise. But it hasn't actually cut out big money. And so when we look at what's needed, we're still trying to face, and this is where I'm less positive, and sorry for putting a sour note in the otherwise story of a success here, but this is, I think want to be honest about where there are things that are imperfect as well. And so what we're finding is that um, without the ability to rein in the super PACs, we're not really going to deal with the underlying problem of corruption and imperfect representation. Like we're seeing, if you have a lot of money, you will still have more power and more voice.
Lost audio and video now. Got video back.
Maybe this will work.
Got audio back.
All right. I'm gonna just say one more thing here, which is that when we had, so we've been dealing with the same problem that people around the country have, which is that the Supreme Court is standing squarely in the path between us and reform. And so we've only got a couple of ways to go around that. We do feel like clean elections, public funding programs make a real difference, and they make especially a difference the more local that you get, which is why that we're looking at expanding to county level government. And so I was very interested in the story about the death penalty, because what we're finding is that there is a real need for these programs and anti-corruption measures in our county government, which is where all of our criminal justice system is. Our DAs, our sheriff, our county commissioners, these are incredibly important positions that almost nobody pays any attention to or can run for. So we're looking to expand clean elections at that level. We're also looking for ways to build the movement that ultimately gets us where we need to go, which is, I think, either a constitutional amendment that reins in money in politics, Supreme Court reform that reins in money in politics. Whatever the mechanism that gets us there, it's going to require a real vision of what our democracy should be looking like and what the role of money in that needs to be. And so, the reason I've been skirting a little bit around talking directly about super PACs is that the referendum that we passed last year overwhelmingly to rein in super PACs was just struck down in the district court. And so it's yet another example of the courts getting in the way of what people really want to see here. And so what I'm looking at now is how do we keep building a movement that is not just in the courts or in any one particular policy or campaign, but that allows us to be nimble? How can we talk about the millionaire's tax, which is a thing that my organization testified in favor of in Maine for the first time ever this year? Because we're seeing the way that the impact of big money is showing up in so many ways. And if we can't get at the campaign spending, maybe we can get at the source of it, which is the income inequality. So I think what we're finding is that, yes, we've been able to make some success with these specific reforms, but ultimately what we've had to do is to continue being very nimble about the policy itself and focusing on the organizing and the movement building.
Great, thank you, Anna. Thank you to all of our speakers and to everybody putting great questions in the chat. Keep doing it. Anna, you raise a question that maybe I could address to all of you or any of you that want to speak to it. It seems a lot of times the federal government is in the way of state level progressive successes. But when you go to the local level, sometimes the state governments, if they aren't cleanly enough elected, are in the way. Predatory lending that I used to work on, I think fracking, other issues where you have successes locally, and then the big money goes to the state capital and takes it away. How do we figure out what to work on that's going to stick, that's not going to get preempted by a less democratic level of government? Anna or Rob or Phineas?
I would say very briefly, I think we found that that learning the procedural things and being really paranoid, like if you're the campaign manager, you have to be really paranoid that anything that can go wrong probably will go wrong, and probably 10 things you didn't think of that procedurally will show up as roadblocks. And that we've been finding that the way around it is just to have as broad a coalition and diverse group of movement and like people in our movement as possible, because sometimes we're going to need lawyers and sometimes we're going to need people who know the political background, and sometimes we're going to need people who don't mind getting out in the streets and getting rained on and collecting signatures. And we're going to need a movement that has all of those people, because the obstacles are going to keep changing as we succeed. I don't think there is any one foolproof way around it.
Yeah.
Well, I will say for criminal legal reform, that's typically not the case, because there are, hundreds of criminal legal systems around this country, and criminal laws are predominantly made and enforced at a state level. So, for better or worse, we enjoy federalism with respect to criminal laws, and in Virginia, I think in recent years that's been a good thing for us. We are a Dillon's rule state, so those laws that are passed by the state, preempt any progressivism that a lot of progressivism that might be tried at a local level, but that hasn't been too much of an issue for us.
Indeed. Phineas, did you want to speak to this?
I mean, we have our own kind of version around this with progressive tax policy, which is that there's the threat of there's constantly evoked the threat that if we raise the taxes on our rich people, that they will flee away to other places. And I would say that was probably the most effective opposition argument against us. And it was really hard to convince people that, a real benefit of being super rich is you get to live where you want, and even a few points in tax difference isn't going to make you up and move away from your family and your businesses and such. But it's a sort of something where it's other jurisdictions become a kind of threat by virtue of by virtue of tax competition, and it's something which gets really overblown, but which is there, and we really had to address and continue to have to address.
I remember football players and other possible victims of head injuries suggesting that they would flee Massachusetts. They would take their riches elsewhere. And you're seeing the same threats now in New York City because it's on the verge of electing a decent mayor. Is there any evidence that you can take to New Yorkers and say these threats were real, they really left, or these threats, because I've heard the counter argument, they're not going to leave New York City. They don't want to live in Hoboken. They're going to stay in New York City. They're just threatening. Are the threats real or not?
I mean, they'll always find the one or two people who actually did move, or maybe maybe they didn't really move for taxes, but it was, they felt better saying that they were doing, a smart tax move, instead of saying that they like their golf buddies in Boca Raton more than their buddies in New York or something. But so they'll always find those examples, but the evidence is really clear that it doesn't, even where you have places right next to each other, like between Washington state and Oregon, or places where the jurisdictions would be just so easy to move across boundaries, people don't like to move. And so that kind of millionaire tax flight is more a myth than anything else.
Good to know. Somebody in the chat says they recently read a study to that effect. If they can put a link to it in the chat, it would help us. Rob, there were a bunch of questions for you, and one of them may not have a simple answer. Was what percentage of death penalty convictions were false?
It does have a simple answer. Sam Gross and Barbara O'Brien, a couple of law professors from Michigan State, did a study back in 2014 that found that 4% of people on death row have been exonerated, I think, since 1973, something like that. So there's a study, I'll put the link in the chat.
Well,
They published a paper, 2014.
exonerated means had the great good fortune for there to be DNA evidence that was preserved when nobody even knew what it was for and so forth. Like that doesn't tell you the full extent of falsely convicted, right?
No, and I apologize, I'm reading the summary. I haven't read the full paper, but it looks like they did an analysis where they extrapolated the likely number. So
Yeah.
I don't think it's just based on the statistics of people who've actually been exonerated. I think they've done some sort of
So
greater
what was
analysis.
the likely percentage is what?
4%
4%. That's it.
of people on the row. Yeah.
Yeah, that's lower than I would have thought. There's a question, Anna, in the chat that you've already answered there, but maybe you want to answer out loud. Did you get more women candidates through these reforms?
Yeah, we did. And it's something, one of the things that we've been tracking that's actually the easiest to notice is that we've seen a big group of both anecdotally, we have had a lot of women say that they didn't feel like they had access to the same kinds of networks of wealth that some of the men they were running against did. Or that culturally they felt like fundraising was a particularly challenging thing to get in. But we have seen higher percentages of women using it and women who use clean elections ending up winning. And we, like I said, we just hit gender parity in the state legislature, not last election, but the election before. So that's been a really great thing to see. We'd love to be able to, have a better sense of things like, are there more working class candidates? Are there more people from different occupational backgrounds? We have anecdotal evidence, but one of the things, and this is a reform that I would say has to go hand in hand with having the ability to run, is the ability to serve. And Maine has a part-time legislature where it's part-time, but while you're doing it, it has to be your full-time job. And so who can end up being able to serve tends to be people who have either a spouse that's supporting them, or they're retired, or they're working for a law firm that doesn't mind that they're in the legislature, so there are still a lot of barriers to serving if you don't come from a certain kind of background and occupational status. And so we ended up supporting a bill to double the salary, which is still 40,000 across 2 years now for the legislature of what it was for, because we're seeing that it's not enough. Like, yes, it helps to be able to run without being wealthy, but you also still have to be able to do the job. So those two things, in my mind, those two things need to go hand in hand.
Great answer. And people are putting a lot of useful links in the chat, which we will email to all of you later. But I wonder if I could ask each of you, Phineas and then Rob and then Anna, because there are repetitive questions in the chat. Who was your opposition? Did anyone oppose this? In your case, Anna, who brought that case that went to the Supreme Court? And also repeatedly in the chat, don't Republicans hate this? What about Republicans, et cetera? So maybe we could start with Phineas.
Well, certainly the Republican establishment in Massachusetts did not like the millionaire's tax. But the real funding came out from the Massachusetts Tech Collaborative, the Chambers of Commerce. There were, I think, just a handful of candidates who put up most of the individual donor money, uh, whereas our side was more spread out on the individual side. We had on our side, uh, we were really had the benefit of real strong support from financial support from the unions. Really did pony up to help make this happen, especially the teachers. And it really made a real difference for us to be able to get our side of the argument out there. But the opposition was strong.
Good, you succeeded anyway. Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. The law and order types were opposed. You know, I don't remember all the law enforcement lobbies that went on the record opposing abolition. There was enough dissension in the ranks within the Virginia Association of Commonwealth Attorneys that I think they could not take a position. Typically, VACA is our chief opponent with criminal legal reform, the Prosecutors Association. But there were enough sort of reformist prosecutors who supported abolition that VACA couldn't take a position. But you know, there were legislators. One of them is now the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Virginia. He was before that role. He was Speaker of the House for a couple of years in Virginia, and you can better believe that he and his friends were in the House were opposed to abolition. And I will say on the Democratic side, there were a couple of senators, Dick Saslaw and Chap Peterson, both sort of conservative, moderate Democrats from an older school of the Democratic Party in Virginia. You think back to the Democratic Party in Virginia in the 50s and 60s, the Bird Machine. These were segregationists. And, you know, I don't put Dick Saslaw and Chap Peterson quite in that camp, but Dick Saslaw helped write the death penalty in the 1970s. So he was real tough to turn, but ultimately, to his credit, and he's still around. He's in his 80s now. He's retired. But to his credit, he voted for abolition. He could see the way the wind was blowing. But yeah, absolutely, law and order types were very much opposed and just didn't have the votes. There was one Republican, Bill Stanley, criminal defense attorney, who walked out of the Senate rather than vote on the bill. But otherwise, it was fairly partisan vote. There were a few Republicans in the House who supported.
Anna.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a mixed bag for us. So the opposition initially in Citizens United and in some of these cases did come from conservatives who wanted to spend, huge amounts in these races. There has been a core of Republicans in Maine that haven't liked clean elections. They're not a fan of using any, taxpayer-funded elections, but that's been a minority. And what we've ended up seeing is that in a state that's very rural, with people who do not have a lot of money, and where we have term limits and a constant need to be recruiting new candidates, it's a useful tool for both parties. And that's ultimately, I think, why we've seen it succeed as much as it has, is that the political establishment has come to see it as useful to them, as well as it can be a disruption, but it also, I think, has been useful. And so that sometimes we'll see people who use clean elections and then vote to defund it, which I find quite frustrating. But we will have seen that quite a bit. The other thing that I think is important to think about in terms of the opposition, though, is that especially in the last few years, we've really seen that um, the Democratic establishment and people in progressive organizations who do political spending have also really started to oppose some campaign finance reform. They have a sense that, if they are not spending huge amounts of money on IEs, they might lose the state house majority, that they'll lose their influence there. And so there's a sense that actually being able to compete in and even be able to outspend Republicans in their big money races is actually, essential to their political success. And they're not in favor of campaign finance reform. And I think one of the conversations that we keep having, and this is again where I'm glad I work with people who have been around and doing this for a very long time, is to point out that the way things are right now is not the way they have always been or the way they always have to be. And so while it might seem kind of hard to imagine that there hasn't always been this unlimited spending, it has not always been the case, and that we could get back to a place where it doesn't have to be again. And so I do feel like sometimes that, like, imaginative work, and insistence in that we don't always have to be like political realists at every moment is actually really essential to this, because otherwise we end up having quite destructive arguments with people who otherwise we might be agreeing with on many issues.
And I know it's America, for which the rest of the world does not exist, but there are many countries you can look to for bizarre successes that one otherwise has to imagine as fantastic. If people are willing to look outside of national borders, right?
If we hadn't had the Buckley-Valeo decision in 1976, we too could have actual limits on the amount of money, not just that people can give, but the amount of money that campaigns could spend. We could say your campaign can only be 6 weeks and you can only spend this much money. Like, those are not unthinkable ideas and ways of running a democracy. It's just we have been kept from pursuing those policy options for so long that we sometimes forget that there are even options that are out there.
Yeah. Let me ask a question to Phineas and Rob or Anna. If you want to jump in, feel free. Who funded the campaign? Who supported the campaign, as opposed to who opposed it? And in particular, for you, Phineas, was fairness or inequality the original motivation? What were you talked about the motivations for public consumption, but what were the motivations of the people who drove this initially?
Well, so the the effort had been started years of just being unable to have the resources to invest in public needs, to invest in the programs, the infrastructure that knew we needed in Massachusetts, that we'd seen, you know, recessions come or cutbacks come, and really things cut, and that there just weren't enough resources, and at the same time we saw this growing inequality. So it was a way to meet both of those needs. In terms of who supported our campaign, there was very large number of independent donors, but as I mentioned, it was very helpful having organized labor also willing to really contribute, SEIU and especially the Mass Teachers Association, really helped to support that. And their members had to be convinced that this was going to be the right thing to do. And, for SEIU, they're really a healthcare union. So for them to put the effort into it, they had to see that this was just the right thing to do for the state, for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, even though it wasn't narrowly, going into their spending programs.
Yeah, wonderful that they did so. Well, let me ask Rob a question, and Phineas or Anna, feel free to jump in on this one. What other states might be next in the progress of this particular reform? Are there any states looking to the example of Virginia or Maine or Massachusetts, or asking for advice?
Yeah, I am not up on all the death penalty in the whole country. I know because I spent a summer working in California on death penalty cases, and I know that California has long had a federal court order blocking imposition of the death penalty. It doesn't mean that folks aren't getting sentenced to death. California has the largest death row in the country, and has for many years. But I don't understand California politics, so I can't speak with authority on this. But my goodness, if California had an actual progressive governor who wanted to end the death penalty, it seems like the legislature might send such a governor a bill. I don't think they have that right now. But I think I know there are a lot of committed folks in California who've been working for decades to try and end the death penalty there. I will say another state that might surprise some folks, Ohio. Ohio's had a long, terrible history with the death penalty, and there are conservatives in Ohio who want to end the death penalty. And I think when you can get that sort of bipartisan agreement, I have some friends out west working on it in Nevada, where there's divided government, concerned conservatives for abolition. So, I don't know that it's going to be California. I hope so, because California has way too many people on death row. But I'd like to see one of the more conservative states end the death penalty.
I think with single payer healthcare and many other things, the way the California legislature works is if the governor's a Republican who will veto it, then they pass it. And if it's a Democrat, then, well, no, you don't want to embarrass him. So I think it might take a Republican governor who tricks them and actually agrees with them. But Anna, did you want to
That's
speak?
pretty funny. Yeah, I did want to shout out Montana, where they're doing, I think, a really interesting ballot initiative right now. They have a new theory that was developed where there's the ability of states to basically states can define what a corporation is in their state when the corporation registers with the state. The whole idea of it, what are the powers of that corporation, can be defined by the state. It's a power that's rarely used, but kind of goes back to the very like foundation of some of these as the role of like the original colonies in some cases. And so Montana wants to try to pick this up and use this power of the states to try to say, actually, any corporation registered in our state or doing business here, for that matter, can't be spending in politics. I think it's a really interesting idea. The legal scholars who are looking at it are trying to take it's a very different approach because it doesn't get tripped up on the free speech places because you're not putting a restriction. You're just saying at a very more foundational level, these are the powers of corporations. I am not a lawyer, so if that sounds wrong to you, please forgive me. But the Center for American Progress has been working on this, and there's a campaign that's just was announced and getting underway in Montana that I'm really interested to follow. We've been seeing from the public funding side a lot of progress recently. New York State is a great example of this, where they now have a program with matching funds that I'm excited to see how that plays out for them. But for a long time, Maine passed its law in 1996. We got Arizona and Connecticut that followed. And then for a long time, there wasn't anybody else. And it is now, I think, really exciting to see more cities and then some states that are starting to really pick up this approach and trying to make our elected officials actually a bit more representative.
Um, Terrific. We're at an hour. I don't want to go too much longer and try everyone's patience, but do any of you have questions for each other?
I'm curious, Phineas, just because we've been working on a, a bill for a millionaire tax in Maine in the last legislative um, cycle, and we got close, but we couldn't get the governor to agree to any kind of a tax increase, much less, even though she's theoretically a Democrat. Um, and I'm curious if you always knew that you were going to have to go to a referendum and planned it that way, or if you thought that you might start out, if you ever had hoped that this would be a legislative thing.
Well, the folks in the coalition before I had gotten to it had been, working back, the recession of 2008, 2009, really way back, trying to push a major progressive taxation measure through the legislature without a ballot initiative, and kept failing. Kept being that leadership just wouldn't let it happen, and the best routes were also blocked by this constitutional barrier. So to change that, we really
Mhm.
had to go to the ballot, and it it's hard to imagine something like that, at least in our state, winning without going to the ballot. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that may be the direction we end up having to go. It was exciting though to see in this past year that some Democratic legislators who hadn't been supportive in the past were more willing to, and that the extreme tax giveaways to billionaires that were happening at the federal level um, somehow seemed to shake loose for people the idea that maybe the states needed, if things were getting so unfair federally, maybe the states had a way to try to shift the balance even a tiny bit back. So it was interesting to see how strongly the federal news was also impacting people at the state level.
That's great. If I could just ask you, I don't know if we have time, just how the the different campaign funding system just changes the kind of deliberation that they have without the blanket ads and such being as much. What kind of difference you saw, maybe especially at the local level?
Yeah, we still, unfortunately, because we can't restrict independent expenditures in the tightest races, there will still be PAC spending. And so, sometimes it gets frustrating, like, this didn't reduce the overall amount of money in politics, that's still increasing. I think where the success is that if you're not that the highest spending candidate, you know that you at least have a decent floor to get your voice out there. And so we've seen sometimes, the candidates that have huge amounts of outside spending come in their favor or attacking their opponent. Those candidates don't end up winning because the opponent was able to do enough. So that's, I think, been the biggest difference. But I think on a more micro level, I mean, our state house races are very small. It's only 5,000 voters in a house district. And if you have to start your race by collecting $65 contributions from those voters before you do anything else. And so this was my experience because I ran as a clean elections candidate in a primary in 2016 in a part of Portland. And the first 40 were easy. And then the next 20, I thought, I've kind of gone to everybody I already know in this district. I guess I really do have to start doing doors in February if I'm going to actually, get the rest of my contributions. And so it did do exactly what I had been, saying to people that it would do, and that it forced me to go out and actually start talking to voters and really doing that, direct contact. And because it was only $5 that I was asking for, I wasn't just thinking, oh, let me go to the wealthiest neighborhood first. I was able to actually take my neighborhood and go around and talk to my own neighbors and try to do it that way. And so I think in that way of trying to bring, when I talk to people in other states, I'm always appreciating that I think in Maine we are closer to our legislators and we have the sense that they should be accountable to us. They're not always, but we have the sense that they should be. And I think that political culture has definitely been reinforced by the Clean Elections program.
Wonderful to hear. Let me give the final question to Rob, which has come up in the chat, which is basically, is there any evidence that getting rid of the death penalty results in increase in violent crime, in murder, etc.? I can't imagine there is, but is there?
I'm certainly not aware of any such study or attempt to try such a study. You have to go through each individual homicide that's been committed since the death penalty was repealed and see whether it was eligible under the previous. I mean, there's just the relationship between the death penalty and deterrence has always been sort of mythical. So I can't believe that murder rates have anything to do with the death penalty.
Were opponents of abolishing the death penalty in Virginia even suggesting that would be the result?
No, no. The argument has really always been about retribution, that sort of, Immanuel Kant style thing of, each person is an end in themselves and ought to be treated that way. And somebody who commits such a heinous crime ought to be given the harshest punishment. That was always the argument I heard.
I want to say welcome to an additional speaker who's here 1 hour late as we're just wrapping up. I'm really sorry to say, Dennis, can you unmute?
Yes, my apology, family. I'm so sorry about being so late. I'm Dennis Febo. I'm the lead organizer and founder of the Abolish Slavery National Network. We're an organization that moves to abolish constitutional slavery from state constitutions and the federal constitution, in which we've had success in 8 different states. We have 8 states ready for legislation coming January of 2026. Our goal is to hit the number of states needed to ratify a federal amendment, which is at 39. So I just came out here to kind of like just promote that this is part of our movement. When we talk about reforming and transforming justice, we cannot transform a justice system whose founding principle is based on slavery and involuntary servitude. So we get into the conversations of transformation and reform. It starts to become difficult to modify the issues around justice when we know that the prosecutor, the police, the judge, and everybody else involved in the court system only have 13th Amendment slavery to rely on to implement criminal. So here we say that each state and the federal government must violate international law in order to enforce criminal law. Why? Because slavery is abolished in all of its forms, and according to the Declaration of Human Rights, Section 4 says that slavery is abolished in all of its forms. The exception clause to the Constitution on slavery is a form of slavery, therefore in violation of international law. Slavery has defined a status or condition to any or all of the rights of ownership exercised upon an individual as ratified in international law, which the United States ratified. The United States has both international law and the 13th Amendment exception juxtaposed to each other, creating a constitutional conflict that allows the justice system to continue to move outside of human rights. So that is our move. We're here to bring humanity back to this movement, and we can only do so by removing the legality of being able to dehumanize someone in law. If you want to learn more about what we do, abolishslavery.us or Abolition Nation on social media.
Okay, we unfortunately we have to wrap up now, but Dennis, I would love to have you back on another time. Dennis Febo is the national lead organizer for the Abolish Slavery National Network. Also with us this evening has been Rob Pogenclass, who's executive director of Justice Forward Virginia, and Phineas Baxendall, policy director of the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, and Anna Keller, who is executive director of Democracy Maine. We will send you all of the links and the video of this live stream teach-in. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to Bill. Thank you to Ryan. And thank you to everyone for the terrific questions. Good night until next time.